But let's begin here in Ontario, where the provincial government is defending its back-to-school plan after being under intense pressure from parents, teachers' unions, and school boards to change it. Yesterday, the province unlocked $500 million in reserve funding for school boards, meant to help them ensure students can physically distance. But it did not move on demands from teachers and parents to reduce class size limits. For more on why, I spoke earlier with Ontario's Minister of Education, Stephen Lecce. Stephen Lecce, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much, David. Good to be here.
You're letting school boards dip into their reserves, $500 million to maybe reduce class sizes, but you haven't ordered it, you haven't made it mandatory. Why not just order smaller class sizes and give boards the money and the time they need to do it?
Well, we are announcing, as per a few weeks ago, a $309 million increase in investment for all school boards in the province. That's an ancillary investment. It's the largest per pupil investment in Canada of any province. But I think what I'm hearing from school boards is, look, they want to ensure that we're following the best medical advice, which is on distancing, of at least 1 meter of distancing within our classrooms. Notwithstanding that Ontario, unlike many provinces, or in fact all provinces, are mandating masks within class, we still believe there's more we can do on distancing. So what we've said to school boards is, look, we're going to unlock these reserves. These are cash on hand, unspent dollars that are rainy day. And of course, we are in the midst of a generational pandemic. Now's the time to utilize those funds, put it to work on something we agree with. The $500 million we're unlocking enables them to, yes, with specificity, focus on reducing classroom sizes, increasing class spaces. And because public health has not suggested a certain quantum of children is advisable, it's more so just about ensuring distancing. And so what we've done is we've given boards money to do that, to put it where it counts. In some boards, they're going to focus on kindergarten, the grade 4 to 8 panel, where those issues may arise. In others, they may focus it in different grades using different means, including getting more access to community spaces. Right, so we didn't want to be prescriptive.
But we've seen other provinces mandate it. New Brunswick did this yesterday. 15 is the cohort they want for their early grades, in particular kindergarten. Your approach gives them the option and maybe some means to do it, but it's going to lead to an inconsistent approach across the province, is it not? Because you haven't mandated a one class size fits all.
We've suggested that in order to ensure kids are safe, a plan that has been endorsed by the Chief Medical Officer of Health in Ontario, which is the most senior medical authority in Ontario, the distancing of at least 1 meter is paramount, which is why we've unlocked the largest investment to date of over $309 million. And then yesterday, an additional $500 million, yes, in school board reserves, but an additional $50 million on ventilation, which is important from an environmental perspective, and new monies on remote learning. So
yeah, I want to pick up on that. But you've unlocked the $500 million to maybe increase distancing, to lease space and do things like that, and $50 million for HVAC and ventilation. This is all happening as summer nears its end, where school is expected to open in just a few weeks. So how do you expect schools to get that money, make those upgrades, and then have everything ready to go with school just opening in a few weeks?
Yeah, we've been providing school boards with enhanced investment. About a month and a half ago, we announced over $700 million in net new funding for school boards. We're leading and investing more in this province than we've ever done as a government in the history of Ontario. But we recognize this is a historic challenge. We're dealing with the pandemic and obviously with the health and safety of our children. And so we've added more money. About a few weeks ago, we announced another $309 million, and just yesterday, new funds. I think what I'd signal to you is what we're doing is scaling up our plan, adding new layers of prevention over successive periods of time, which I think just underscore we're going to do whatever it takes to get it done. On ventilation, I mean, in the context of how can they do it for September, we've already allocated in Ontario $1.4 billion for maintenance funding, largely focusing on things like HVAC and air quality systems. We're simply giving an additional $50 million in a one-time investment to accelerate that, focusing on those older systems, older schools, and in those communities where we reside with higher rates of transmission. So, for example, in Toronto, there's a bit of a, if you will, a hot spot in the Northeast and Northwest, giving the boards the flexibility, going back to your first question, and the nimbleness to apply the funding where the needs are, is we think the best practice in order to realize the greatest return on the investment and just to make sure these classes, wherever they are safe.
But, you announced this money yesterday afternoon. Within a couple hours of that, I've got a 6-year-old kid who's in the Ottawa Carleton system here. I got an email from them saying they don't really know what this announcement means for the school board in this city. They need some time to study it. But the deadline to decide if parents are going to send their kids back to school is this weekend. So parents have to make a decision on yes or no going back to school when the school board can't tell us how this money specifically will be used and what exactly it will look like when you send your kids back. I mean, how are parents supposed to cope with that situation?
Yeah, look, I think parents right across the world, are facing a great level of angst on the decision they have to make. and it's not lost on us as an uncle and as someone with many family members who work in the public and Catholic system of education. I understand that angst. Our obligation in the Ministry of Education is to demonstrate to parents that the plan we have unveiled is safe. It has been endorsed by the most senior medical officer in our country, the very gentleman, Dr. David Williams, who has ably advised the cabinet how to navigate this pandemic. It's why I would argue there's causation between his advice, our adherence as a province to his advice, and the fact that we've had 7 to 8 consecutive days under 100 positive cases, even though we're testing 20 to 30,000 people in a province of 14 million. It's a good sign.
No disrespect to Dr. Williams. There are other doctors and medical experts who say that you should be focusing on getting class sizes down to 15. I mean, there is not a unanimity or a consensus in the medical community that Dr. Williams' advice is necessarily correct when it comes to back to school.
Well, the public health advice, including that of sick kids, did not mention a quantum in classes, to be fair. They did suggest distancing of at least 1 meter, which is why we've enabled the investment. But when you look at when you benchmark this, David, as a national show of all the provinces in the country, in the areas of cleaning, of testing, of screening, we're the only province with 500 public health nurses that we're hiring. We're the only province to do asymptomatic surveillance testing of high school students. We have the highest investment in custodian in cleaning, 1,300 new custodians. We have a protocol in place for outbreak management that has been reviewed and peer reviewed and I think embraced by local health officers in the province, where they understand with clarity what to do, how to do it, and how to ensure we have a health capacity to respond immediately and proactively to keep the kids safe. The chief medical officer is the officer that is advising our cabinet, and it is his advice, the command tables, the research tables, everything that has informed his decision. When he was asked this very question, he looked directly in the camera and said, without hesitation, this plan is safe. And I could assure fair parents out there that, while appreciating fully the anxiety of making the decision of both remote or online learning, this plan is based on the research, the evidence, and it is going to be continuously scaled up, meaning, as I said a month ago, we will build upon it. We will add new layers of prevention, which is precisely what we've demonstrated yesterday. And we're going to keep going. There's always more things we can do to de-risk the circumstance. And that's the moral obligation we have to our kids.
You have a situation where you have higher income parents, for example, who can go to distance learning. They can afford the computers. They can look to private school option. They can look at tutor options. But we have seen throughout the data in Ontario and in other parts of Canada that low-income populations, racialized community, immigrant populations, they suffer the most and are least likely to be able to look at other options for their education or deal with distance education. So how do you support students from those communities from the risk of going back to school when they may live in crowded living conditions at home, for example, on top of the risk of going back to a public institution? Absolutely.
I have a shared interest in ensuring that low-income students and families are not left behind as a consequence of the pandemic. It makes the case for reopening schools. I think it's those very students where the developmentally, from the access to nutrition programs, equity of internet and the technology and devices, actually it underscores the necessity of reopening, which is perhaps the one thing the medical community is unanimous on. With respect to how we can mitigate those gaps, the first is in investments in technology. Yes, indeed, some families don't have access to devices or broadband. Our government has invested over $15 million, the single largest investment in tech, to procure north of 37,000 new tablets on top of the 200,000 that are already out there in school boards that the province is funding. We have built a network and a relationship with Rogers and Apple, for example, among other telecommunication companies, to provide low-cost internet to low-income families, and school boards are providing that. But you are absolutely right. We have a duty in the context of our reopening to ensure that those kids have their support. And it's why we announced an additional $20 million in mental health funding, because we think, particularly from those lower income families, although many kids right across the income and right across the spectrum, if you will have faced adversity and social isolation. So again, making sure they have access to psychologists and psychotherapists and social workers to enable them to succeed is critical. Getting our schools reopened is foundational to their health. And finally, making a point to their parents that we're going to work very hard to make sure that in those communities that their ventilation is improved, that their air quality is improved, that we do everything humanly possible, especially in communities with higher rate of transmission, that we're going to reduce those classroom sizes. That is the commitment. And the investments we put in place are benchmarked in this country the highest on a per pupil basis. And I think it just underscores that the Premier, Doug Ford, and our government will do whatever it takes to keep families safe.
Yesterday at your announcement, you accused teachers' unions of being difficult and raising objections and being obstructionist in part of the process of getting back to school. But, if you look at what's being said publicly, there is overlap between what the teachers' union are saying and what parents are saying, what principals are saying. I mean, are people really being obstructionists, or are they just being human and worried about this? And I wonder how you think language like accusing them of being obstructionists, how is that helpful as we try to open schools with just a few weeks to go?
Well, I mean, the question was in response to the fact that the teacher unions, a few minutes before I did a press conference, put out a letter after suggesting they will litigate against the province, suggesting that they're going to take further action if they don't get a certain amount of demands. That happened sort of minutes before my press conference. So it's a fair question you may want to ask the teacher federations. I'm responding to their question, and I'm responding to yours today by asserting that the time is now for collaboration. I mean, we're dealing with a pandemic. The Prime Minister and the Premier have built, and the Deputy Prime Minister and the Premier have forged a very positive, constructive relationship working across party lines. I've done the same with my Minister for Childcare, Minister Ahmed Hussein. We are doing whatever it takes across provincial lines and ideologies to work together and collaborate. And if we need a bit of wiggle room in the context, or we need a bit of flexibility from our teacher federations, it's not a criticism, it's a fact, David, that in the midst of a recession and a pandemic, we need to be reasonable. And that's why I think on questions like synchronous learning, on live learning, the Zoom-style classrooms, when we say we want to have a higher quality and expectation, it is really necessary to have the teacher unions instructing their members to do more than the bare minimum. And I think that's just really being objective and really asking for more collaboration, not in the interest of government, in the interest of the child, where we have a pedagogical opportunity to improve the quality of their learning and the consistency of that learning. And I just think it's an opportunity, if anything, to work closer together over the coming weeks to keep these kids safe. I just don't really want to stay focused on the differences and maybe them trying to relitigate issues of the past. Let's stay focused on the shared objective, which is safety. And for your members, for our kids, we can do this.
So you mentioned wiggle room and flexibility. We've heard from the Toronto District School Board that they may have to delay the reopening of school. People want to know how this $500 million is going to be spent and used. Will you allow people to delay, stagger, or push back the first day of school so they can make these decisions and so parents know what they're signing up for?
Yeah, what I've said to school boards, and in fact, we put out a memo confirming that, essentially suggesting staggering schools over the first week to minimize the volume of students on the first day would be a prudent step in de-risking our return to class, and certainly one supported by public health, just to really mitigate many students congregating all at once on one day. So
what about pushing it back entirely, not just staggering, pushing it back a week or two if that's what's needed?
Well, I think right now we believe, and school boards have suggested, including Toronto has come out this morning, suggesting they may need additional time for the first week. And that's something we could accept. And we put out notice to them that we will work with them on that, including other boards across the province, to be quite frank, if they need a few days, essentially having kindergarten and grade 1 in the first day and the rest, grade 2 and 3 on Tuesday, and sort of staggering that entrance would be a prudent way to minimize contact and ultimately just taking a bit of a more cautious reopening. So we're going to be working with them. We want to make sure kids get back to class, but we'll be reasonable in this respect.
Just one final question before I let you go. I'm wondering if every member of your government who has a school-aged child, if they'll be sending their kids to public school in class this year, all the MPPs, all the political staff, because politicians like to say we're in this together. Will all of our kids be in public school together?
I must admit, I wouldn't speak for Cox. I haven't surveyed them, to be quite frank. I'm just very much focused on building a health protocol for parents out there. It includes them. But the aim really is just to build confidence amongst parents or moms and dads out there that the protocol is endorsed by the chief medical officer. It's got the funding and the resources. We lead the country in testing and in virtually every measurement. And I just hope that everyone who's making the decision will know that Ontario has given you a choice for remote learning and online, which no province has, as I understand. And ultimately that should you choose in-class learning, it will be safe. We will do everything humanly possible with the investments of staffing and the cleaning to do that. And we'll keep building upon it based on the advice of the chief medical officer and the leading pediatric doctors who have advised our cabinet to date.
Okay. Stephen Lecce, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was Ontario's Education Minister, Stephen Lecce. We're going to get some reaction now to what he said. We're joined by Ryan Bird, who's a spokesperson with the Toronto District School Board. That board, like a lot of boards, has been inundated with questions from concerned parents about whether there's enough time to open schools safely. So thanks for being here, Ryan Bird.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Let's start with that big question. I mean, do you have enough time to safely open schools with the plan as it exists right now?
Well, and that's what we're looking at right now. As you highlighted and the minister highlighted, there was some significant news that came out this week that now looks at specifically our elementary classes will likely look a lot different. So now, with a little over 3 weeks to go, we have to now decide if we can get that done in time, whether we have to use the staggered approach, as the minister suggested, a couple of grades here, a couple of grades there on day after day, or do we need additional time that we'd have to seek permission from the ministry? We'll have to wait and see. We're still calculating all the numbers to see exactly what it would look like. And really, we need all of our information back from our pre-registration survey to know how many kids plan on returning. And then we also have to find out, as far as our funding, using our reserve funds, how we make that all work.
Right. So this was the big announcement yesterday, about $500 million. They say they unlocked is the phrase they use, and another $50 billion for HVAC and air quality upgrades. The minister said yesterday work's already been underway on that. It should be no problem to get it done in time. It seems like a much bigger lift than maybe he's saying. I mean, what is your sense? Can you get this done in the couple of weeks you've got left?
Well, and that really is the million-dollar question. We're trying to figure that out right now. Obviously, with smaller class sizes, it means more classrooms, because if you're taking an average class, let's say of 24, 25 kids, and splitting it in half, that's an additional classroom. Now, when you consider that we have probably 170,000 elementary students across the TDSB, that becomes a larger issue. We'll need more room. Some schools will have enough room. There are extra classrooms, the gym, library, we can make it work. Some other schools, though, are already at or above capacity, and we'll have to look to other non-TDSB facilities just for space. So that's why we're working with the city to look at possible, public libraries or local community centers that we may be able to use. Whether we'll be able to pull that off in 3 weeks, we should have a better idea next week, but we just don't know yet.
So you have permission to tap into your reserves, right? That was sort of the substance of the announcement yesterday. And I think you've got about $130 million in reserves in your school board. But I've heard officials from your board say that it would be a financial risk for you to dip into that reserve to create lower class sizes. So how much of a risk is it, and how viable an option is this really for you?
Well, and that's what trustees are going to be discussing next Tuesday at a meeting. The fact is, this $131 million is not a rainy day fund sitting there with nothing attached to it. The fact is, it's actually attached to future obligations, a majority of that going towards employee benefits. As one of Toronto's largest employers, with nearly 40,000 staff, as you can imagine, when it comes to employee benefits, we have to make sure that we're covered. So I think there is a prudent level of risk that we can take. It's just a matter of exactly how we do that. And that's going to be the big question next Tuesday, when our trustees get a look at the different pots of money, where that money is going to come from, and how much risk we're comfortable in taking. At the same time, we want to make sure that we can lower those class sizes, because we know parents want that. So it really is going to be a bit of a balancing act as we try to make sure that we're okay financially, but also address the health and safety concerns of parents.
Right, but if you dip into those reserves, because of those future obligations, you're going to have to find that money again somewhere down the road, and that becomes the risk that you're absorbing, right? It undermines your ability to be able to operate properly as a school board.
Well, exactly. We're borrowing from ourselves and hoping that we can pay ourselves back in the years ahead. But, these are extraordinary circumstances, and we're obviously willing to look at that to get the job done.
Okay, so you've parents, I'm sure, emails, calls, texts, whatever, probably even letters in this day and age. What are the number one concerns that you're hearing from parents right now? Is it largely and almost entirely based around class size?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest issues right now, is that they want smaller class sizes. But the other questions they have are just about questions. They still have a lot of them. We're trying to answer as many of them through every medium, whether it be letter, website, social media, phone calls. We're trying to answer as many questions as possible. But the fact is, while we have been able to solidify some aspects, for example, the health and safety process at a school and maybe how a COVID case would be treated, there are some other questions that just have no answers quite yet. So that's what we're trying to get out as fast as we can. Because I think in the end, if you do have concerns, you do have questions, for our part, the only thing we can do is arm people with information to make the decision that works for their families. So we're trying to get as much of that information out as possible, but it does seem to be changing on a regular, somewhat daily basis. So we've been trying to keep up with that and keep our parents informed.
Was this a curveball yesterday? What happened yesterday? I mean, you've been planning ever since they announced their school reopening plan, and then this just happened where they suddenly said, hey, you can borrow from yourselves, as you described, if you reduce class sizes. A lot of criticism has been that should have been done back in June. This should have been done months ago. I mean, were you kind of broadsided by this?
Well, we had been asking for some time for additional funding so that we could have smaller class sizes, but we didn't quite expect what happened yesterday as far as the unlocking reserve funds. We thought it was going to be additional funding. So it's not exactly what we expected. We've tried to roll with the punches, but nevertheless, it's a significant development that now we have to take back and make further decisions, which further delays the information that we get out to our parents so they know what's going on come September 8th.
Just one last question. How confident are you that you're going to be ready by September 8th?
We are doing everything we can. We are aiming for that September 8th, and we'll get a better sense next week. But, you can see by the expression on my face. I honestly just don't know. We are powering through it, and we're going to do our absolute best to get there for September 8th. But we'll have to see how everything unfolds as we try to finalize our plans next week.
Okay, Ryan Bird, thank you so much for your time and your candor. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That is Ryan Bird with the Toronto District School Board. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about Ontario's back-to-school plan on today's show. Earlier, we spoke to Provincial Education Minister Stephen Lecce, who defended his government's decision not to lower class sizes in elementary schools. Instead, the government has what it's called unlocked $500 million in reserve funds for school boards to help ensure students physically distance. For reaction, we're joined now by the president of the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association, Liz Stewart. Her organization represents approximately 45,000 members province-wide. Liz Stewart joins us from Toronto. Thank you so much for making the time, Ms. Stewart. I'm wondering if you can tell us right off the bat what you're hearing from parents and maybe from your members about the province's plan.
Well, I mean, certainly from parents, we're hearing their anxieties around what school's going to look like in September, and their hopes that, their children will be safe. From my members, exactly the same anxieties. They're concerned about, what's going to happen in September, what their classrooms are going to look like, if they will be safe, if the students they serve will be safe. So those are all of the anxieties and stresses that they're all feeling on this, 3 short weeks before school begins.
Premier Ford and Minister Lecce tried to reassure some of those stresses and concerns yesterday with the announcement of the $500 million in access to reserve funding to create space for students. Does that $500 million ease any of the pressure that you're feeling?
Well, not really. I mean, one of the key pieces is we're now 3 weeks before the start of school. In fact, we have schools that will be starting next week. So the issue is how is any of this going to be able to be put in place in a timely fashion? And, why won't the ministry just come out and tell school boards that they need to reduce class sizes and be clear about what the plan should be? I mean, from the beginning, this has been just an abdication of responsibility by telling boards at the very beginning that the plan was that they go make plans, and now, periodically dropping pieces of information on them and having school boards scramble trying to fit that into whatever box they've already started to build.
So based on that, do you think there's any way that schools can open on time as intended with this change announced yesterday?
I think it'll be very difficult. I know you've got a lot of good people trying very hard to make sure that we can, but I think it will be significantly difficult. I mean, let alone trying to get all the ventilation systems up to code and running and proper so that we can make sure everybody's safe.
The Ford government has really kind of painted the relationship between the government and the teachers' unions in this province as combative. I just want you to listen to what the minister told me in her interview earlier today. Just take a listen to this.
We need a bit of flexibility from our teacher federations. It's not a criticism, it's a fact, David, that in the midst of a recession and a pandemic, we need to be reasonable. And that's why I think on questions like synchronous learning, on live learning, the Zoom-style classrooms, when we say we want to have a higher quality and expectation, it is really necessary to have the teacher unions instructing their members to do more than the bare minimum. And I think that's just really being objective and really asking for more collaboration, not in the interest of government, in the interest of the child.
What's your reaction to what the education minister just said?
Well, I'm sure if the minister tried really hard, he could be more offensive towards my members and certainly towards us as an organisation. We have done nothing but try to cooperate. I mean, we've had to write letters in order to try and get a seat at the table and try and have our voices heard, because it's so important that, yes, that there's all of this theory that is important too, but it's also equally important that the practicalities are talked about. There's the theoretical and then there's the practical. And we have been trying to be that voice. We have indicated time and again we're willing to be flexible. We have indicated time and again we're willing to sit and have reasonable conversations. The problem is we have completely differing definitions of what collaboration means. To us, collaboration is that we work together and we try and find common solutions to problems. The government's definition is that we sit in a room quietly, listen to what they have to say, and then do whatever they think we should do.
You are collaborating with other teachers' unions. You've threatened legal action against the Ford government regarding its back-to-school plan. Is that still an option you're considering following Stephen Lecce's recent announcement yesterday and his comments today?
I think it's indicative of the frustration we all feel. That's how we feel. The only way we can get our voices heard and make sure that we're at that table, making sure that we can keep everybody as safe as possible. We understand that nothing's ever going to be perfect, and we understand that we need to be flexible, and we're more than willing to have those conversations. But we need to make sure, and I have a responsibility to ensure, that to the very best of my ability, we're using all the tools that we have to keep my members safe as they enter classrooms, because if they're safe, then the students they serve are safe.
A lot of the money announced yesterday, it isn't actually new money. There was some top-ups of reserves for school boards, but really they're just letting school boards dip into existing reserves of cash. Some of that money is earmarked for things like benefits for employees and teachers and maybe some of your members. Is this the right solution? Is this a good solution? Or what more would you need to see from the Ford government on this?
Well, I think the government actually has to really rethink and offer some real monies to boards to assist them as they move forward. Because you're right, all they're asking the boards to do is take money from themselves and, have a future liability, which is frankly not helpful, because all it's doing is kicking a problem down the road. When in actual fact, what they need to do is ensure that there's adequate funding so that we can make sure that the correct measures are in place. We all understand that, well, we all pray and hope that this is, not going to be a long-term issue. This isn't going to be a year-over-year cost. We're talking about for the coming year until, hopefully we have vaccine and we have things in place and we know people are safe.
As things stand right now with this plan, will school be safe in the fall?
We continue to have concerns. We continue to have concerns that, there's no way they're going to be able to get all the ventilation systems up to code where they need to be, so that we can make sure, that's certainly one of the big measures that I know, the doctors of certain medical advice has told us. I think we also need to make sure that, there is correct distancing. And the only way we do that is by lowering class sizes. And the only way we can do that is by making sure that boards have adequate funds. And by telling boards they can utilize reserve funds, it is frankly inequitable, because boards all across the province have differing amounts in those funds. And so some will be able to do more than others. And how that's constructive, I just don't know. How that helps our students, I'm flabbergasted trying to figure it out, because I would think that the government, just like we do, wants to make sure that the return to school in September is safe for everybody and that it can be sustained, because stability is important and we all understand that. But we do that by putting every measure we can in place.
Okay, Liz Stewart, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That is Liz Stewart of the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.